Hey, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules today to be with us. This is the culmination of a lot of effort among a lot of people and a number of you today who have participated in this survey over the years, different iterations of it, and we're thrilled to have you with us today. So with no further ado, I want to share a little bit about our agenda today and introduce my colleague, Irina Thompson, who heads up our aging services practice for Marts&Lundy. And as you can see before you, our agenda is, of course, to have the big reveal today about the study. We're going to be talking about the data set and methodology that we used, our thoughts about where aging services philanthropy is headed, and also some of our other research and work going on tangentially related to the topic today. So thanks again for being with us today. And as we're thanking people, I in particular want to thank the members of our editorial review board who were essential in getting us to this point. You can see the names and pictures of our wonderful colleagues who participated with us over many, many months. They were invaluable in terms of helping us shape the lines of inquiry, in terms of fostering participation, reacting to some of the findings, and helping us shape the recommendations. So a huge thanks to our editorial review board. Irina just put up a second ago a little bit of the history and the evolution of how we got to this point. And you'll see on the left there the philanthropy report for Ohio Living back in 2017. I had actually date the evolution of the study that you're going to be hearing about today, actually back to the early 2000s, when there was such a dearth of information about this sector that individual client organizations of our firm at that time, Richner, would contract with us to do benchmarking studies so that we could get some kind of centering on what is normative in this sector. So over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a tremendous evolution, which culminates today with the PASS study that Irina is now going to lead us through. We're both incredibly excited to share the results of this year's Philanthropy and Aging Services report. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Irina to lead us through this. I will be monitoring the Q&A, and away we go.
Thank you so much for that, Cedric, and thank you all again for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in to the data, our methodology, and the findings and recommendations. At the end of our presentation, there's going to be a web address and a QR code if you want to scan that with your phone. That'll take you directly to the Marts&Lundy landing page for the study, where you'll be able to download the full report. Because we only have less than 60 minutes of your time this morning, there's just no way we're going to be able to get through all of the data. So consider this sort of an introductory highlight course, and then you're welcome to dive in at your own time and leisure with the full report. So just by way of a little bit of framing, so I am thrilled to share that this is the most comprehensive data set that we have that specifically looks at fundraising in the aging services sector. And we asked participating organizations for their most recently completed fiscal years worth of information. So we're looking at 2020 to 2022 effectively in this data set. And what that means is we're starting to see the impacts of COVID on philanthropy in the sector. So that's a lens to keep in mind when you see some of these results. Most of our participants are continuing care retirement communities and life plan communities. Most of them have residents on site. Now, because we had such a range of respondents from independent single site organizations to multi-site, multi-state organizations with campuses numbering in the dozens, the data had quite a significant distribution. And so our analytics team recommended that we look at medians rather than averages, because that diversity of data was really going to skew the averages. So all of the numbers reported are going to be medians. Now, fortunately, we have a truly national scope in the 2023 results. We worked with 257 communities across 41 organizations in 20 states, with serving thousands and thousands of older adults. So again, most comprehensive data set, and we're really thrilled about that. The respondents to the study represent an almost even split between single site organizations and multi-site organizations. Of course, when you add up all of the different campuses from the multi-site organizations, we do have a larger representation from those organizations if we're looking at a campus by campus level. A majority of our respondents reported that 62% of them reported that they're fundraising in a departmental model compared to 38% fundraising through a foundation model. And when we ran the numbers, we saw costs and benefits to each of those options. You can see in the table on your screen where each model outperformed in different metrics. Now, writ large, the foundation model in the 2023 data appears to secure larger gifts, have bigger campaigns, and have overall higher fundraising totals. But that performance has a cost. Foundations are costlier to operate, and so they have slightly higher cost to raise a dollar, slightly lower return on investment. Now, what this sort of diversity of performance tells our team is that there's no magic bullet to, we can't sit here and say a foundation model is always going to be better for fundraising results. It really depends on your unique circumstances, your organization, your history with philanthropy, and taking all of those factors into account to determine what's going to be right for you and where you want to take your fundraising program in the future. But we are hopeful that this is a good starting point for some of those considerations for you all. I want to talk about some of the main actors and drivers that we're seeing in aging services philanthropy. So if you saw the 2021 results, this should not be a surprise. We continue to see that residents are one of the driving forces of philanthropic investments in the aging services sector. Now, what I hope this chart tells you is that there's that incredible variety of data that we're seeing in our respondents. Each one of those slides is a data point that we collected. So you can see that there's quite a significant range. So we have some respondents that are raising a fair share of their funds through foundation funding, for example, but it's not quite the norm. What we're seeing more commonly is that residents are, by and large, the biggest chunk of your philanthropic investors in the sector, followed by individuals other, and that can include family members of residents, community members, board members have their own category, but other staff leadership, for example, as well. Now, the board, we really saw set the tone for fundraising. The median board size that our respondents reported was 12 members, and the median board participation in giving was at 100% this year. So we're seeing that movement toward the gold standard of total board giving. Organizations that reported using a foundation model to fundraise were more likely to reach that gold standard of 100% giving at 92% versus 55% of organizations fundraising through a departmental model. And similarly, organizations that were single site organizations were more likely to get 100% board giving than multi-site organizations. We also saw higher fundraising results from those organizations that reported 100% board giving at 1.8 million median, compared to those organizations reporting less than that full board giving. I want to pause for a minute in case, Cedric, you wanted to add anything or if any questions have come in.
I want to invite people to submit your questions via the chat function. Sorry, Irene, I'd like to ask you at this point in the presentation, what was the biggest surprise or takeaway from you in this second iteration of this that you've led on behalf of the firm?
I think it was really an affirmation of where we're advising our clients spend the bulk of their time. You know, I would say writ large, the organizations that we're working with are operating with pretty lean fundraising teams. And that means we really have to be decisive about where we're investing those limited hours in the day. And so for me, seeing that residents are one of the biggest drivers of philanthropy just reaffirms that, you know, as a development director, as a frontline fundraiser, as an executive director, that's where I want to be spending my cultivation time. You know, we have so many board members that come to us and say, well, what about the Gates Foundation? Or I heard this foundation is interested in supporting older adults, but I would say by and large, that's not where our clients are seeing success. And so it's really helpful to have this kind of data to inform planning.
Irene, it's a great point you're making, because when I reflect on my 25 plus years consulting in this space of aging services, what you just said corroborates what's also happening writ large at the national level in terms of philanthropic trends, where individual donors dominate giving to all nonprofit organizations nationally. We're seeing that phenomenon also playing out in aging services. So thank you for that. We do have a question below. So the percentages for donor types adds up to about 75%, less than 100%.
Yeah.
Categories besides residents and other might not be shown.
I think that's a function. I'd have to check with our analytics team, but I believe that's a function of how we've chosen to display the data because they are median results.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to keep talking about the who that makes philanthropy run, and we can't omit the fundraising staff, which I know many of you on the call, that's one of the functions that you likely perform. So the median team size of our responding organizations was 2.25 full-time equivalent staff members, often split across multiple focus areas, but the ones that we saw most commonly were major and planned gifts, annual giving and events, and then other administrative functions, you know, whether it's grants or other internal administration, database support, that kind of thing. The number that I really want to point your attention to, the numbers that I want to point your attention to, and this was something that was incredible for me to see, was that for every fundraising FTE that our respondents reported, organizations gained a median of $803,000 in fundraising revenue. Now that's a gross number. When we took out fundraising expenses, organizations still gained a median of nearly $700,000.
You know, Irina, I would just like to point out what a huge improvement that is, that far outstrips inflation and other macroeconomic indicators since we've been looking at this sector. That's a gigantic increase from a decade ago, where that result was substantially less than half of that figure.
Mm-hmm. And so I just want to highlight these numbers. If you want to take a screen grab of this, please, it's of course in the full report, but if you want that now to show your CFO and your president, I welcome that. To me, this is one of the most compelling metrics that I've seen about the importance of investing in fundraising, which I know can sometimes be a tough sell to the organization. But when we look at this kind of incredible bottom line, particularly in our sector where the margins can often be so slim, it's tough not to want to move toward these median numbers. Cedric, anything else you want to add at this point?
No, thanks, Irene. Please, please continue.
So how are organizations accomplishing these incredible results? What are the vehicles that galvanize fundraising? So we also sought to answer some of those questions. And one of the things that the 2023 data really corroborated that we also saw in 2021 was that reaching and reaching beyond $1 million in philanthropic revenue was a dividing line when it came to performance and scale. And that scale really had impact. So for organizations that tipped that $1 million revenue mark, they saw significantly better performance results, nearly 4 times higher return on investment than organizations that were raising lower dollar amounts than $1 million. We also saw better performance on a per independent funds raised on a per independent living unit basis. This metric, the funds raised per independent living unit, is one that's unique to our sector. It was first deployed in the Leading Age Virginia 2017 study, and it allows us to compare fundraising results across organizations that have vastly different sizes, scales, and footprints. And you'll see on this slide, we've sliced and diced those numbers in a different way so that you can look at overall trends. You can also look at, how does it shake out for single site organizations versus multi-site? And then again, that distinction between raising over $1 million and raising under $1 million. You can see that has a significant impact on the median funds raised per independent living unit. But if I'm doing a quick back of the napkin calculation of what is a typical organization's fundraising potential, this is a number that I go back to time and time again. So I invite you to compare your own organizations to these metrics and see how you're stacking up. We also saw significant movement toward organizations utilizing endowment. 65% of our respondents in 2023 reported that they have endowment holdings. Now, just by way of comparison, in the Leading Age Virginia study back in 2017, that was only 10% of respondents reporting endowment holdings. So I think we're seeing that increasing realization that endowments can be a wonderful buffer in times of organizational or economic uncertainty. And we're seeing that greater movement to utilizing them, as well as more funds held in them. So you can see that gradual increase from 2021 to the 2023 data too. We're also seeing significant movement and very different campaign metrics compared to even just 5 or 6 years ago. I believe that the sector is shifting more akin to what we've seen in education, with a regular cadence of campaigns where if an organization is not actively in a campaign, they're probably thinking about their next one. And so we saw almost 60% of our respondents were either in campaign mode or had recently wrapped one up. Now, what constitutes a campaign still varies widely in the sector, and you can really see that in the range of campaign goals that were reported in 2023, but the median was at about 3.8 million. I want to also talk about the metrics that organizations can use to think about their performance, in addition to some of the ones that we mentioned earlier. But very common ones are cost to raise a dollar and return on investment. all of our responding organizations were well below the Better Business Bureau standard of 35 cents to raise $1. Single sites slightly outperformed multi-site organizations, which makes sense given the likely concentration of donors. But I think regardless of the type and the structure of the organization, what really stands out to me is that fundraising has a greater than threefold return on your investment. And if I were a CFO or a CEO, I think I would be hard pressed to find another bottom line in my budget that had that kind of return. Cedric, anything you want to add at this point?
I actually want to make a comment going back about the about endowment in the context of what you were reporting, Irina, about the healthy cadence of campaign versus non-campaign mode. I also view the increase and emphasis and focus on endowment as a very healthy sign for the sector, as it really conveys that donors have more confidence in making larger investments in this sector that endowment style fundraising also connotes. You have to have a level of trust and belief in not only in the mission, but in the efficacy and value of giving gifts to this sector to consider endowment. I mean, most, as we know, a lot of donors don't consider endowment giving until they're really convinced of the long-term value of supporting a mission.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cedric. Okay, I want to talk a little bit too about why donors are giving and where we're seeing those compelling opportunities within the sector. So this chart represents the main areas that we saw organizations reporting fundraising priorities for. And capital needs, you'll see that benevolent care retook the top spot in 2023. In 2021's data set, capital needs were in the top spot. We also saw employee scholarship and support move up the ranking in 2023. And I think that's one of the impacts of having COVID numbers in here. We saw a significant push for employee support, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. And I think that these numbers bear that out. I have a hunch, though, that as we have more longitudinal data and we continue to run this survey on a regular cadence, we're going to see different priorities jockey for the top spot and be responsive to current events and other impacts on philanthropic giving. So to me, it's less important which priority claims number one, and more that this helps organizations understand that to capture the broadest possible array of donors that want to give to your mission, we need to have a well-rounded menu of opportunities to share with them. I think Cedric can corroborate that when he started working in this sector, the real focus in the sector was only on benevolent care for those organizations that even had a proactive fundraising program. And I think that this growth and focus on additional opportunities for philanthropic investment gives our sector the best chance to capture the broadest possible swath of prospective donors who care about our missions and want to contribute. We want to give them the options to give in a way that align with their personal passions, and having that menu of opportunities is one of the ways we make sure that we have something that's aligned. Now, I'm really, really excited to share a special research section that we added to the 2023 survey results. And I particularly want to thank Cedric and the Editorial Review Board for their guidance in helping us hone in on this line of inquiry, because truly we had so many questions in so many different areas that we wanted to research, but we also didn't want to make the survey too onerous for participants to take, and at the expense of getting any data back. So transformational giving was the topic that won out. So I want to share some of the main findings from the questions we asked specifically focused on transformational gifts. The main thing is that transformational gifts take time to realize. Now, with this graph, I think represents some of the bookends of what we've seen in aging services giving. We know that when donors are ready to make a gift, often they want to make that gift quickly. And we think that's what explains the decent percentages that we're seeing after cultivation of less than a year or less than 2 years. But the majority is that transformational gifts take more than 3 years of cultivation to realize. Now, an important challenge or consideration for us as professionals to think about is that right now, the average fundraiser's job tenure at an organization hovers at just about 3 years. So if your organization has staff churn, particularly in positions that have major gift responsibility, you could be missing out on these transformational gift opportunities. And a consideration can be, how can we make sure that we're recruiting and retaining star staff in this field? Unsurprisingly, residents were also the main drivers of transformative gifts, with community members coming in as a distant second, but the majority came from residents at 61%. I was actually surprised, quite frankly, by how high the community member report was for transformational gifts. And I think this is an area that merits some additional study. And I think we can all think of some of those headlines that we see of, a surprise bequest coming in from somebody who wasn't a resident and only had a tangential connection to the organization. So perhaps there are more of those out there than we realized.
Irina, not surprisingly, there's considerable interest on this topic, and we do have a few questions rolling in from our colleagues. First, I want to ask, the question was, does transformational giving include legacy gifts?
Yes, that's actually, that's going to be a subsequent slide. So let me get to that in just a couple minutes, okay?
Yeah, before you go to that, so what is our definition or the definition of a transformational gift?
That's a great question. That's also going to be on a subsequent slide. So let me just move that. There is no definition right now in the sector, is the short answer. What we asked respondents for their largest ever gift. And so that's what we're reporting on when it comes to transformational giving. So you can see that there is an incredible variety in what that means to different organizations. Everything from, a low six-figure gift to a multi-million-dollar gift. The median hovers at about 2 million.
Okay, and speaking of that, does our data set include planned giving revenue commitments?
Yes, it does. So we also asked for, what was the giving vehicle for the largest gift ever received, and you'll see that far and away bequests came in as the primary mode for those transformational gifts, with cash coming in a distant second. But we also have grants, securities, and real estate as well. But I think that to me, this heavy weight in favor of bequests speaks to the need for a strong and proactive planned giving program in the sector.
Thanks, Irina.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions at this point?
We're set for now. The audience is set for now. So.
Okay. I want to go back to where those transformational gifts were going. So the survey respondents reported that the biggest attractors for those transformational gifts were capital projects and benevolent care. So to us, it really speaks to the big ideas are the ones that can welcome and accommodate the big gifts. We talked about the wide range of transformative gifts in the sector, that there really isn't, there's not consensus on what constitutes a transformational gift yet. And the different vehicles that transformational gifts come through. I want to make sure we have time for any other questions before we unleash you to the full PDF download of the survey.
Any other questions from the group today? Don't be shy. Irina, I'd like to ask you, now that we're through the initial slide deck, if you were advising a board of directors at one of our clients, you just finished a presentation on this topic, what would be your bottom line set of recommendations, or how would you summarize today's findings in light of all the work that you've been doing over the years on this topic?
I think the biggest thing, and we're actually presenting to some C-suite members in the sector next week, and to me, the biggest takeaway that I think we need to reinforce, particularly at the leadership level, is that it takes money to raise money. Because I think I often see either an unwillingness to invest or the willingness to invest, but then the expectation of immediate results. And you do need to invest, but then it also takes time to see some of those results. So to me, that is the most important thing. But if you're bringing on the right staff and you're structuring your programs in a strategic way based on the things that we know work in the sector, you can realize some pretty significant returns. And so that's the message that I hope this data can underscore for organizations all around the country.
Yeah, I really like that sentiment, Irina, as well, especially in light of your comment earlier in the presentation about the operating margins throughout the sector. As you know, with all of our work across the country, that we're seeing double-digit resident fee increases commonly across clients, and operating margins are very thin. Generically throughout the sector, not just in aging services, most studies suggest that the cost per dollar raised hovers around 25 or 30 cents. So a 3 or 4 to 1 ROI fundraising when compared to a 1 or 2 or 5% operating margin for an organization. This is very, very lucrative dollars that accrue to the bottom line of the organization, while the aggregated dollars might not be on the scale of the top line revenue of a lot of our client organizations. The impact of philanthropy, I've observed, is nothing but growing. So I really like what you're saying about the continued investment in the patience that goes with it. I do have a couple more questions that I'd like to offer from the group. So there was, just to recenter us on the number of participants again, this was an increase over the last study we did. I think this represents, again, at the beginning, Irina, we were talking about perhaps approximately 257.
Yes, 257 sites across 41 organizations in 20 states.
Yeah, and on this topic, thank you. And on this topic that we were just discussing, there was a question, are there any studies on the correlation of resident giving and increases in living costs? Before you answer, I'm going to plug this at the end, but I want to plug it now too, is that we really hope that you will continue to stay with us and participate in these kinds of studies, because we hope to deepen and enrich the data in years ahead. But go ahead.
I wish that there was a study looking specifically at that. And I can tell you that whenever we speak to any convening of organizations in the sector, this comes up. So I don't have hard data, but I do have anecdotal evidence that when organizations are planful in the messaging of those fee increases, so that it doesn't come as a surprise to residents. There's sort of ongoing communication from leadership, both at the corporate and local level, depending on the organization structure, then it does not preclude proactive fundraising. We have seen organizations be successful as long as the messaging around those increases is carried out in a thoughtful and strategic way. We've also seen the inverse of that, where when it has come as a surprise, that it has had really detrimental impacts to fundraising.
Thanks, Irina. There was also a comment I think is worth noting. COVID has impacted costs, especially hourly wages of healthcare employees, which have to be passed along to residents. First of all, I think that's absolutely true. And then Irina, I wonder if you want to make a comment about the ways in which fundraising can be helpful in terms of employee retention and matters related to employees.
Yeah, I think there's what we've seen from working with our clients is that among your prospective donor base, they're going to be very understanding of the ramifications that COVID, supply chain issues have had on the workforce. There is not a single aging services organization that I have talked to in the last year that is not facing significant workforce challenges, and your prospective donors know that. So I think being upfront with them about, these dynamics have shifted and it costs us more to employ the folks that you see on a daily basis and that we know are so important to your care and well-being and happiness. We have seen donors be receptive to that message. The flip side of that, to Cedric's point, is that there are things that philanthropy can do that aren't necessarily baked into operational costs that can help with employee retention. Things like scholarship support for increasing education. Somebody moving up from working in the dining hall to becoming a CNA. We've seen some clients who have citizenship support programs for their staff, transportation augmentation, depending, that sort of last mile shuttle service from major metro stations. There's so many ways, childcare facilities on site. There's so many ways that philanthropy can support the lived experience of your employees. It's really about what makes sense for your workforce and your organization.
Great. Thanks, Irina. Pivoting away from some of what we've been talking about, going back to the issue of campaigns and campaign style fundraising, which I agree with you has been proliferating in recent years. Again, very healthy for the sector. The question is, any data on how long the campaigns were? Campaign structure, or all staff or volunteer? There's certainly anecdotes that you and I can speak to from our consulting work, but is there anything that you want to say on the topic?
We didn't specifically ask for that in this iteration of data. I'm sure we could slice and dice it, but I worry that if we were to do that, because we didn't ask specifically about campaign structure, that there may be some conflation of sort of, broader fundraising or foundation structure and the campaign effort, just because we didn't structure the question that way. But I definitely think that it is a ripe opportunity for future research.
Yeah, and I appreciate these questions because these are all things that we can integrate into future studies. I would say a couple of things is that I have also seen an increase in recent years in comprehensive campaigns, as opposed to project-specific campaigns or modest capital campaigns for things like wellness centers, things of that nature. And with that comprehensive approach is coming both longer campaign counting periods, um, and campaign durations that are more like other sectors, 4, 5, and 6 years. The typical framework for most of these capital campaigns has typically been about 18 months, in terms of active campaign period, with the pledge periods typically being 3 to 5 years, which again is sort of normative across many subsectors of nonprofit organizations.
Yeah.
But campaign style giving, again, that sounds like it's a ripe area for a featured topic in a future study. Go ahead, Irina, you were gonna.
Just that I would also add, so this isn't specific to the aging services sector, but Marts&Lundy has a robust database of campaigns and campaign activities. And what we found, we did a comparison between campaigns that happened pre-2008 and campaigns that happened post-2008. And what we saw was that the impact of campaigns that take place during a recession, which may be relevant, we hear a lot of client concern about, economic headwinds right now, is that campaigns that happen during a recession can still very much be successful. They just have a slightly longer period. It's usually lengthened by about a year, but are still very much hitting their goals.
Just one other comment or question for you, Irina, that's adjacent to what you just said. What is the impact of recessions on giving writ large? Could you speak to that?
Yeah. We have robust data on that. Cedric, as you know, the Giving USA Foundation has been tracking overall philanthropy in America for decades. And so we do see blips. I believe the only time that total philanthropic contributions actually went down from the prior year was in 2009. So, following just the catastrophic events of 2008. But the bounce back is very, very quick, and philanthropy remains on an upward trajectory, including in the most recent round of data for 2021.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully I just didn't jinx the entire sector by even mentioning the word recession. Now, obviously, there is talk of a recession, but I just want to underscore what you just said, Irina, about the bounce back. That's been true across, when we look back over the last 40 years through different kinds of recessions, through 9/11, through lots of macro-sized, often traumatic events in our national environment. Philanthropy slows down at a slower rate and rebounds faster.
I think it is important to note, though, that, despite that upward trajectory, there are other factors that are masked a little bit by that. And what I mean is that bigger philanthropic pie is increasingly contributed by a smaller group of people. And I think that mirrors some of the wealth disparities that we see in America. And again, I think buttresses some of the findings that we shared earlier in this report about your residents being an important focal point for your philanthropic efforts, because they're likely among those individuals that are contributing an outsized amount to that bigger philanthropic pie.
Yeah, that might be one of the most important contributions of this whole study, is reinforcing that notion about resident giving. Because when I started to consult in this area in the late 1990s, there was considerable pushback about residents as donors. And I find that to be less and less true, particularly with CCRC life plan communities, and especially ones that demographically skew toward the top 1% wealthiest Americans. And I think that's a very good thing, because a lot of these residents remember, all of us, that These are often people who have been very philanthropically generous throughout their entire lives to other organizations, not the place they live. So it's very important to give residents the opportunity to say, you know, you can also impact this mission, the place where you call home. You can have a tremendous impact right here on the campus.
Well, and I have to plagiarize one of my clients' board members who just had the best turn of phrase when I was on site earlier this year. And she called a philanthropic investment in her campus enlightened self-interest. And I really, really love that turn of phrase, because I think it's something for us fundraisers, it's important for us to remember that, you know, if I'm making a contribution to my alma mater, to my place of worship, I feel good about it. I'm not necessarily going to benefit personally. If I'm adding a pickleball court to the campus where I live because I want to play pickleball in the best facility available to me, that is very much like an, you know, quick and tangible benefit that I also get a tax write-off for.
Great points, Irina. So I realize that our time together is drawing to a close today, and I want to put out one last plea for any questions or comments that all of you that are participating today would like to offer. While I'm giving you a minute to marinate, I've got two final comments, and Irina, there might be a couple of comments that you want to make as we wrap up today. And maybe you can even talk about what your hopes and dreams are for the future of these kinds of studies going forward.
Yes.
But my final comments are, again, two. First of all, I want to once again thank the editorial review board that Irina referenced at the beginning of the presentation today. I mean, this really would not be possible with all of you, without our friends and colleagues who care about this topic. This study was made much, much better through the participation of our editorial review board. Just a great sense of gratitude to our colleagues. The other thing I want to mention is that just how much I think that we can all give ourselves a congratulatory pat on the back for not only being here today, but for continuing to push and assert the value of philanthropy for this sector. With 10,000 baby boomers a day hitting retirement every day in the United States, aging is a hot topic in the United States. And I just am grateful to all of you as my colleagues for continuing to show the value and the impact of philanthropy and how it can save and change and enrich lives across our clients. I'm going to turn it over to you, Irina, for final comments. And I see a question or two, one more question or two percolating in, but take it away, Irina.
Great. So I just want to invite everybody to download the PDF of the full report. If you just point your phone at the QR code on your screen, it'll take you directly to that page, and you'll be able to do that. And you can review at your leisure. Cedric and I welcome questions that we know inevitably will come up after you've had the chance to look at the full report. So please don't hesitate to stay in touch with us. I want to echo Cedric's thanks to the editorial review board for guiding the lines of inquiry. Also to all of the survey participants in 2023, as well as in 2021, none of this data that I think is enabling our sector to work smarter would be possible if we didn't have folks sharing their fundraising results and their information. So I appreciate the willingness to be giving of your data. And that I hope that the results are useful to you as you're thinking about where can our fundraising programs go from here. Please do keep the questions coming. Like Cedric said, it can help inform future lines of inquiry. Our goal is to continue running this survey. We've had a tremendous response so far in terms of interest and utility from the sector. I know folks are sharing this with board members, using it to facilitate their annual planning processes. So that's exactly our intent. And we want to continue that to get you that information as conditions in the sector and across philanthropy change. So we very much want to keep going with this, and thank you for your participation in making that possible.
And we are available for speaking engagements at statewide conferences and so on for leading age. Keep that in mind. Before you all start to drop off, there was one last question that frankly, I haven't heard asked in all of our presentations in the last couple of years. So I think it's worth bringing up before we break. And that question is, who's coming into the sector to take these jobs? Is it people with aging services experience? Is it people who maybe they were the former director of marketing, like at one of our clients just today or earlier this week made that transition, or other? So how are people finding this sector and coming into this sector, particularly at the director level? Any observations from you, Irene, on that?
Great question. I would love, if we do a more fundraising workforce line of inquiry in subsequent studies. I think that would be great, because I think we've been involved in enough searches over the years. So I would say my anecdotal observations are that it's very rare for a client of ours who is looking to fill a senior level or a leadership development position to secure a candidate who has prior aging services experience. I would say typically they're coming from other sectors, healthcare, philanthropy, higher education. I can think of one instance off the top of my head that somebody had prior aging services expertise. On the other hand, we also have folks who make that shift from sales and marketing to philanthropy. And so then the learning curve is a little bit different for those individuals. They might have really strong relationships on campus, but not necessarily have that solid grounding in philanthropic best practices. So I would say those are some of the trends that I've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, I would only add that I do think the incidence of people coming with aging services background finally starting to anecdotally creep up just a tad, which again, I think is just so important that we have people who come into this sector, fall in love with it, stay with it, and maybe are able to work across nations in the sector. I just think that cross-fertilization is so important and healthy. And Irina, I know you're aware of a couple instances of former marketing reps or directors of marketing making this transition. I really agree with what you just said. Obviously, fundraising, it's not necessarily brain surgery, right? I mean, you can learn, you can be taught the skills and subtleties of the fundraising. You can be taught the technical aspects of it, but it's much more difficult to teach someone to be naturally relational. And a lot of the people who come over from director of marketing roles and things like that, they're often excellent candidates, especially when they're have been with an organization for a while and they make this transition over. I would say though, the executive directors and CEOs who attempt to do that, what's really critically important is for them to get that training, that coaching, and that understanding. I think sometimes they think, well, they have a winning personality and they have relationships with residents, so therefore they would be a good fundraiser. Fundraising is its own separate and distinct profession. So while I think it's great when those people make that transition, it has to be accompanied with the appropriate support for those individuals, I would say.
Well, and I hope that this study and ongoing versions of it can be one of the resources in the tool belt for individuals making transitions like that to better understand the nuances of fundraising in this particular sector, which is it's a little bit different than what we see again in higher education or other healthcare philanthropy.
Yeah. Well, Irina, should we give our colleagues 5 minutes of their day back? Should we call it a day?
Yeah, thank you again for making the time to be here with us this afternoon. I hope it's been useful. I hope you enjoy going through the full data set, and we look forward to any and all feedback that you have.
Thank you.